Howdy and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to another Patreon-sponsored review. Blah blah blah, you've heard me say it before, these Patreon requests have usually taken me out of my comfort zone, or forced me to endure something really terrible. But this time, I'm just gonna level with y'all. I really don't like poetry. Like, I can appreciate it, don't get me wrong, but I am absolutely crap at reading it. I need narratives, dialogue, stories. So, it's a good thing that filmmakers decided to adapt Banjo Paterson's poem, The Man from Snowy River, into a feature film that includes all of the things that I just requested. And side note, Banjo Paterson is the coolest name I've heard since Pistol Scaramanga. The Australian poem is about a prized racehorse that escapes captivity and joins his brethren in the wild, the Brumby Mob, and the group of riders that are sent to bring it home, including the titular man.
Earthman.
Well, yes, but I figured that was implied. It was published in 1890, which was right on the cusp of when Australia was becoming its own nation and not just a colony for England, so it has a lot of importance to the people of Australia, like American poets from similar revolutionary times have for Americans. I read the poem and it's pretty good, I guess. I'm not really the right person to gauge poetry. It's pretty easy to read, and it has good pacing. And I admit, having read it both before and after watching the film, it's pretty darn exciting. But what I am good at, though, is critiquing movies based on written works. Is it a good adaptation of the poem? Is it an enjoyable movie? Does Chico appear at all in this? Let's find out. This is The Man from Snowy River. The film opens up with the man, Jim Craig, played by Tom Burlinson, and his father planning to go out into the forest to kill the leader of a gang of wild horses, a black stallion that's caused troubles in the mountains for years. But Jim convinces his father that they should instead capture and sell the leader. His father relents, and the next day they go set out to do that. While chopping down trees in the bushland of Australia, they try to trap the stallion, and it was directed by George Miller? Oh, hey, that's the... Oh no, it's a different George Miller. It's not the Mad Max guy. It's the guy who directed Neverending Story 2. The group of wild horses stampede through, taking with them one of Jim's horses, Bess, along with injuring his other. It also injures Jim's father and kills him, leaving Jim with no one since his mother is also dead. At his father's funeral, Jim is approached by several horsemen who run him off his father's land because apparently he has to earn the right to live in his own damn house. Mind you, the dirt hasn't even settled in his father's fresh grave yet. This place is brutal. Though I'm pretty sure Jim's gonna get the last laugh because it's the late 1800s and life expectancy is in the toilet, so he's probably gonna live longer than any of them and get to run their kids' asses out of town. Or, alternatively, Jim's gonna go train and come back and go Batman on all their asses before then. I'm cool with either outcome. Jim is taken in by a kindly old one-legged miner named Stinky Pete, Spur, a friend of his father's, played by Kirk Douglas in heavy makeup. Jim vows to get their missing horse back, but Spur is incredulous, giving Jim his horse because, well...
Man without a horse like a man without legs.
Jim goes into town and sees Harrison, also played by Kirk Douglas, but minus the makeup. Wow, the budget must have been really tiny for this movie. They couldn't afford a second actor. Harrison is picking up his prized horse from a train, but when it comes off the train, it goes a little buck wild, and nearly injures Harrison's daughter Jessica, played by the mayor from Inspector Gadget 2? That is a connection that I never thought I'd see, but cool. before Jim rushes in to calm it down.
Good go, mate. Bloody go!
And thus he became the Horse Whisperer. Oh, no, wait a minute, that's a different adaptation. Harrison's lawyer, who was there, is impressed and recommends Jim for a job working for Harrison, while Spur meets with an old friend named Clancy and they talk over dinner, revealing that Spur is giving Jim his father's share of the mine whenever he actually finds gold, and Jim gets the job at Harrison's. Jim doesn't get on too well with Curly and Moss, the bulk and skull of the stables, but they leave when Jessica comes in. Jessica likes tending to the horses, but she struggles with a rope, even refusing Jim's help. Wait a minute. Abused stable boy? Disinterested girl? Is Columbo reading me a bedtime story? Is this a kissing movie? She sees him effortlessly tie the right knot and asks him to teach her before Harrison comes in and tells Jessica that he expects her to be a perfect lady and not a rough-and-tumble horse rider. That night, the other stable hands talk about Clancy coming to visit Harrison, and Jim mentions that he had met Clancy, since Clancy and his father were mates, though they don't believe him. Clancy rides in the next day, and all the stable hands are excited to see him, since he's some sort of legend, and when Clancy sees Jim, he greets him and lets him stable his horses, along with giving his condolences for his father's death, and proving to the others that Jim was telling the truth. Clancy has dinner with Harrison, Harrison's sister-in-law Rosemary, Jessica, and Banjo Patterson, which is just ridiculous. I mean, really? The writer appearing in a movie based on his own work? Who does Banjo think he is, Stan Lee? At dinner, they discuss women's rights, and Clancy and Harrison get into a small argument over the merits of technology and advancement versus the traditional ways on the sunlit plains. Jim comes in with firewood, and Clancy gets Jim's opinion on Harrison's desire to tame the Snowy River Mountains, taking Clancy's side before excusing himself. Harrison insults the mountain people as mongrels, and Clancy asks if that includes Harrison's brother, to which Harrison darkly states that,
I have no brother.
We'll get back to that a little bit later. The stablemen are packing up for a muster into the mountains, but Jim is left behind on Harrison's orders. Jim is sad to be left behind, but on the upside, Jessica's aunt invites him in for tea. She totally ships them. Jim and Jessica share in their dislike of their current positions, and Jim reveals that he has some proficiency on piano. They also share in their lack of mothers, as both of their mothers died when they were young. Jessica's around birth, as she states that she never knew her. Jim quickly absconds after calling Jessica pretty, and then she returns to her piano lesson, playing much smoother than she did before Jim came in. How about that? While in the stables, Jim learns that Curly is in charge of breaking in the young foals and is appalled.
Curly?
Because, well, Curly is Curly, and expounds his father's wisdom of how you work with a horse to break them and not against them. And Jessica challenges him to break the prized colt before her father returns. After a frankly beautifully shot montage, I'm serious, that sequence was incredibly well done. Jim and Jessica seem to be striking up a friendship, but the gang of wild horses shows up again, and Jim rushes off, despite Jessica's objections to retrieve his lost horse and avenge his father, but is nearly trampled to death for his troubles. Jim worries about Harrison's wrath when he finds out about Jim's actions with the cult, but like that train scene in Spider-Man 2, the witnesses agree not to tell, though Jim offends Jessica by saying,
I'm not hiding behind the skirts of a bunch of women.
Harrison returns and sends Jim out to get 20 strays they left behind, and Jim takes the opportunity to also visit Spur, telling Spur that he had figured out the secret. Spur and Harrison are twin brothers. He wants to know what's up with that, but Spur is tight-lipped apart from asking about Jessica. Jim tells Spur that his plan is to leave once he gets back, but Spur gives him some advice on where to find the strays, using mountain man intuition. Harrison notices the cult has some injuries and marks that it shouldn't, and forces Jessica to admit that her and Jim broke it in and nearly used it to go after the wild horses. Harrison is pissed, and first states that Jim is fired the moment he gets back and orders Jessica's aunt to take her to a ladies' college. When Jessica objects, he slaps her and says that,
You're as deceitful as your mother.
Jessica runs out of the room, and Jessica's aunt and Harrison have a discussion about whether or not she's actually his daughter. And also talk about a night that Harrison fired shots, but his aim was off. Jessica rides off into the mountains, but is caught in a storm and nearly falls off a cliff. Harrison shows some concern for his daughter and rallies his men up to go after her, but they're all drunk, so they won't be any help. Jim succeeds in rounding up the strays and starts bringing them back towards Harrison's, but comes across Jessica's horse and then goes off to rescue her. Jessica tells him that he's about to be fired and reveals that she loves him and only hung on that long on the cliff because she wanted to be with him. Jim wants to bring her home because he wants to finish the job and doesn't want men to be foolishly risking their lives if she's safe, and they share a moment and Jim plans to drop her off at Spur's place, before heading back down to Harrison's to return the cattle and face the music. Spur collapses his mine, but in a unique twist of fate, ends up finding a massive gold deposit. Jim arrives with Jessica, and Jim heads off to find Spur by the creek, while Jessica looks inside the house. They both fail to find him, but Jessica finds a photo of her mother inside Spur's cabin, before Spur shows up to tell Jim the good news. Spur mistakes Jessica for her mother momentarily, before Jim reveals Spur's familial connection. This is a lot for Jessica to take in, and she tries to ask why Spur has a picture of her mother, but Spur evades the question.
Why do you keep this portrait of my mother?
The prettiest visitor I've ever had, and not even a cup of tea. Come on.
Jim asks Spur to take her back to Harrison's, to which he agrees, and Jim goes after the cattle. Spur and Jessica get on pretty well, like a father and daughter, and share a dinner of stolen cattle, his beef being branded with an H. Oh, so that's where Plankton gets his holographic meatloaf from. Holographic cows. Smegging brilliant. Spur brings Jessica home, and Jessica asks her aunt about Spur and why she was never told about him. Her aunt reveals the whole story, that Harrison and Spur fell in love with the same woman, Jessica's mother, and she decreed that whoever found their fortune first, she'd marry. Harrison bet all his money in a horse race, while Spur went off to dig for gold. Harrison's horse ended up winning, likely because of a sports almanac given to him by some old geezer, so Matilda marries him. Jim returns and Spur prepares to head out, so he can avoid seeing his brother, but Jim wants to see Jess before he leaves. Harrison returns and begs for his daughter's forgiveness and thanks Jim for returning her, but when Jim tells him that he loves Jessica, Harrison's tune changes.
The decision is yours. If you have a spark of manhood in you, you know that the right thing for you to do is to walk away. Now hang on.
They get into an argument that's only broken up when Spur comes in and confronts his brother. Spur reveals that the bad aim situation from earlier was when Harrison shot off Spur's leg, and Jessica demands to hear the whole truth. Spur gave Jessica's mother a colt as a wedding present, but Harrison was jealous, and so Jessica's mother let it loose to spare Harrison's feelings. When Spur saw it running off, he naturally rushed to tell Jessica's mother that her horse was loose, and the classic misunderstanding occurred, and Spur's leg got shot off. Jessica's mom wanted to leave, but didn't, and ended up dying in childbirth. And the colt that was freed? Well, everything in this story is connected. That colt ended up becoming the black stallion that leads the wild horses. So, basically, Harrison's jealousy is the reason that Jim's dad is dead, which means that as much as he dislikes his daughter falling in love with Jim, if he hadn't been so jealous, Jim would still be living in the mountains. Spur and Jim head off, with Jessica wanting to join them, but Jim refuses. Harrison confronts Spur about who Jessica's father really is, since he doubted her mother's fidelity, but Spur tells him that while Jessica is indeed his daughter, he doesn't deserve her. Jim collects his things and gets into a fight with Curly, which is quickly broken up from being deadly and descends into fisticuffs, where Jim is the victor. After he leaves, Curly releases the prized colt in retaliation, hoping that Jim will be blamed for it. And now is when we get to the adaptation of the actual text of the poem, with the quest for the horse. Spur tells Jim about his share in the mine, while Harrison calls in riders to find his prized horse. Clancy arrives to meet with Jim and Spur and tells them about the colt. Jim at first refuses to help, but Clancy eggs him on using reverse psychology and convinces him to come along. Harrison rallies his men together and they prepare to head off, with Clancy arriving with Jim in tow. Harrison wants Jim to piss off, but Clancy stands his ground and demands that he come along.
I want him along.
As you wish.
Oh my god, this really is the Princess Bride! Harrison announces a 100-pound reward to get the blood flowing, and they ride off. They find the horse mob and start heading in for their prize. And I don't want to halt the review or anything, but this is just a legitimately beautifully shot sequence. Look at this majesty! Curly tries to sabotage Jim, but fails and falls into the river while they're fording it. They chase the mob to a steep hill that no one, save for Jim, dares to cross, and Jim keeps up the chase. After another beautifully shot and scored sequence, Jim finally faces down his father's killer, and brings the entire mob back to Harrison's stables, including Bess and the new cult. I did something like that once. In Breath of the Wild, not in real life. Harrison offers him the reward, but Jim refuses it. Now that the job is done, Jim plans to return to the mountains to take back his father's land, but he'll be back for a few of the broodmares and Jessica.
There are a dozen good broodmares in that mob. I'll be back for them. And for whatever else is mine.
Harrison is still against that, but Jim says that Jessica can make up her own mind about it, and Spur finally calls Jim a man before he rides off into the sunset. The movie ends with Jessica seeing Jim off as he rides back to the snowy river where the movie started from. And that was The Man from Snowy River, a surprisingly good Australian Western. I usually dislike Westerns because they're usually slow and drawn out, but this story was not only enough to hold my attention, I went in expecting for it to be okay, but not my taste, and I absolutely loved this movie. It's shot beautifully, the backstory before the poem's plot starts is great, even if it is a tiny bit contrived that the stallion that leads the mob belonged to Jessica's mother. But I can forgive that because everyone in the story is connected in small ways. Jim had never even heard of Harrison, but he had known Spur since he was a kid. The music is beautiful and the cinematography is amazing. Not only are the settings brilliantly designed and feel authentic, but the way it's shot, the camera work, is even more beautiful. The actors are all fantastic, and I can say with absolute certainty that Sigrid Thornton gets to give a way better performance here than she did as the mayor in Inspector Gadget 2.
Am I making myself clear?
The chemistry between Jim and Jessica is amazing, and they work really well bouncing off of each other. I was the most invested in their story and loved every scene of them together. Their interactions are the best part of the movie outside of Spur's scenes. Speaking of, Kirk Douglas he's Kirk Douglas, so he's awesome, but playing double duty as both brothers, and if I didn't know going in that it was Kirk Douglas, I wouldn't have thought that they were the same actor, because while the makeup isn't great, he gives off two distinct performances. I'm talking about Enemy of the World level The Doctor and Salamander duel performances. Tom Burlinson is great, and he really gives off a sense of growth, coming into his own by the end of the film. Also, that jump during the climax, all him and not a stuntman, though it was a stuntman when he was trampled by the mob. As comic relief, Curly and Moss are pretty good, and they don't get too into the action, so they're not too distracting. And it's nice to see Curly get his comeuppance in the river near the end. Plus, that fist fight where the foreman tells Curly to lose the broken beer bottle is hilarious. I also like how there's not entirely a wrapped-up ending. There's no reconciliation between Spur and Harrison. Harrison still hates Jim, and Jessica still wants to defy her father's wishes. Leaves it open for interpretation of what happens next. There is a sequel, but it loses Kirk Douglas and replaces him with Brian Dennehy, so I can't imagine that it would be quite as good, even if it still has the chemistry between Burlinson and Thornton. All in all, it was a great movie, but is it a good adaptation of the poem? Having read the poem twice and seen the movie once, I can say firmly, yes. It is a note-for-note retelling that expands on not only the characters from the poem, but also characters from Patterson's other works, like Jessica's mother's name being Matilda, a reference to Waltzing Matilda, another Banjo Patterson poem. Injecting banjo into the movie, giving the writing of the poem, which was written as if Banjo Patterson actually saw the events he wrote about, legitimizes the movie a hell of a lot. This was a fantastic movie, and I highly recommend it. If you hate westerns, watch it, because I do, and I loved it anyway. It's an enjoyable 102 minutes, and one of the best adaptations I've ever seen. Makes me feel like I should check out more of Banjo Patterson's poetry. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of the show. If you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed the video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon, especially if you want to force me to review anything of your choosing like today's review. See you next time for our annual Halloween review. Last year we looked at the first novel of a famous horror writer. But I feel like this year, let's look at a book that inspired one of the most famous supernatural horror movies of all time. And it's an excellent day for it, too. Oh, it was Patterson. What the fuck did I write Banjo Robinson? Shit. I'll go up and re-record that bit at the end.